But we will crack on with our first presentation, which is beyond the home page. And we've got Jacob Weisberg, who's chairman of the Slate Group, who's going to be talking about the difficulties of driving people to the home page, branded home page of any content provider, and so how therefore to distribute content to social and mobile platforms in a more creative way. The Slate Group is a family of web-only magazines providing analysis and comment across politics, news, business, technology, and culture. But without further ado, please give a very warm welcome to Jacob.
Thank you. Jim, thank you for the introduction. I hope you won't need your headsets. I'm going to try to speak in fluent English. I think the reason I'm here is, first of all, because Slate is thinking about expanding internationally. We have one key partnership in France, a French edition that's published as a joint venture. But we find ourselves thinking more and more about what the brand means internationally, and what Slate, for those of you who don't know it, means, I think, is high-quality, original digital journalism. We started Slate 19 years ago at Microsoft. I was one of the founders, and at that point we had no idea what it meant to be a digital magazine. We weren't even really using the term digital magazine then, but we knew that the internet created this tremendous opportunity to reinvent the kind of journalism we've always done. And today, Slate is profitable, it's expanded tremendously, it works as a business. And we feel that this project we embarked on back then, which is to figure out how to create successful business models around high quality journalism, has been proven out and vindicated. But at the same time, this is a business that changes so quickly that what works today not only may not work tomorrow, but almost certainly won't work tomorrow. And you need to stay on top of it, stay ahead of it. Our big advantage, I think, is that we are digital first, digital only. We didn't come out of legacy media. We didn't have print products that we were trying to adapt and figure out. And one of the things, I worked in print magazines for years before we founded Slate, but it's tremendously hard to do print well. It's tremendously hard to do digital well. To do both well at the same time is extremely difficult. And Slate, by focusing just on digital, I think has learned some of the things that I'm going to talk about today about what's worked and then what is going to work in the future as the way people relate to content digitally changes very quickly. The sort of as a framework for my remarks today, we had talked about beyond the home page. I think, being a little more direct about it, you could talk about the decline of the home page. There are very few sites in the world, particularly in the United States, which is the most developed digital media market, where audiences at destination sites are growing. Maybe Slate's still managing to grow our homepage audience a little bit, but most of our competitors and most sites realistically are seeing declines, and in some cases quite dramatic declines. And one difference in the business versus when we got started in it is you just don't have that potential to build organic audience anymore. Because we've had all this time to build the organic audience, it's still many of those people still come to the homepage. But the growth clearly is elsewhere. The growth is in social media and mobile media and in the combination. But I would sort of frame the larger phenomenon not actually as any one thing, not just as the switch to mobile or the rise of social media or the rise of platforms, which I'm going to talk about, but really the move away from that cohesive browser-based desktop experience, which was the fundamental interaction people had with digital content really for the first 15 years or so of the internet. And I hope you know, I didn't bring any slides today. I thought you probably were seeing a lot of them, and it might be interesting just to hear someone talk with the lights on as a change of pace. And I'll try to save some time at the end to take some questions. Just to sort of to give you a little history, the first 10 years of the web really, which I would say 1996 to 2006, you had this very now old-fashioned experience of people consuming content, going to home pages, through browsers, on desktops, at work. One statistic that I like is in 2000, even in the year 2000, which is after we'd been doing Slate for more than 4 years, only 3% of US homes had broadband internet. Until you had really widespread broadband adoption, most of the things we take for granted now didn't work at all. And the main sources of traffic, if you were launching an editorial business back then, were the web portals, AOL, MSN, Yahoo. And then at some point it shifted to search, and all the opportunity for traffic growth was particularly around Google. But until you had that kind of breakthrough in broadband, which hit about 10 years ago, around 2005, 2006, it was very hard to create any successful business models around digital content. One breakthrough was the Kindle in 2007. I think that was the point at which mobile consumption of content began to work. People began to read things not just on desktop and laptop computers. And I don't know if any of you remember that first Kindle device. It was very ugly. It was kind of ungainly version. I think it sold out on Amazon in 5 hours. Everybody wanted one. You couldn't get one. But that was the breakthrough, obviously followed by the first iPad a couple of years later. But that was the point at which it began to be a sort of pleasant and productive experience to consume content in a mobile fashion. Phones weren't there yet. I mean, the screens were still too small. The download speeds were too slow. But I think that changed pretty quickly. It was around 2010 that there was an iPhone that people really would consume content on. And it started to, once that caught on, I think it was the iPhone 4 in 2010, the shift was really quick. I mean, it went from the share of content consumption on mobile media went from 0 to 25%, I think, in 2013, and very quickly to 50%. And on most sites now, mobile consumption is a bigger percentage, and in some cases, significantly bigger percentage than desktop percentage. Slate probably is a little, we still have more of a base in the homepage because we've been at it so long, but even we now get a majority of our unique visitors through mobile. Majority of our page views probably still come through the desktop just for sort of reasons of legacy and habit. Now, one of the big surprises to me when people started to read a lot on phones was what happened to content itself. My assumption had been that it was coming and the content was going to have to get shorter. We always said at Slate that 1,000 words was the maximum for the length of an article that anybody would happily read, comfortably read on a computer. And that's because they were at work and it was a desktop, and that seemed to be, you were really pushing your luck if you went beyond that. And I thought, well, now everybody's shifting to phones. We're going to have to figure out how to do things really well in 300, 400 words, because people are just going to want little bites, little nibbles. Just the opposite happened. With phones came a new vogue for long-form content. And you would see people, I see people on the New York City subway reading novels and nonfiction books on their phones. And what happened was that the screens in particular became good enough that the small form factor ceased to be an obstacle, and the device was good enough for anything you want to read. So anything you want to read, you will read on your phone. And people read War and Peace on a phone. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But for us as content creators at Slate, this shift curiously allowed us to make things longer. Although I think you make things longer at your peril. Because when you start making things in a digital space longer because you can, you're courting trouble. People like to share long-form journalism. There's a kind of way you congratulate yourself on supporting it, being in favor of it, but a lot of it is kind of shared and not read, which is something to be aware of on the content creation side. I talked about sort of the sources of traffic for a site and how it's shifted from organic growth to search. Around 2011, social media really started to upstage search in terms of growth in sending traffic to sites. Twitter and Facebook, but of course particularly Facebook, became the most significant source of referrals. And the portals sort of faded away. And now for most sites, just as mobile is bigger than desktop, social is bigger than search, although search remains important. But the whole idea of viral media began to take root. And viral stories are ones that spread by this kind of power law distribution, where your average story might have 20,000 views, but a story that becomes a viral hit or viral phenomenon can have 2 million views. And what that meant for content creators, as I think a lot of the more innovative sites quickly figured out, was there was a huge return to quantity of publication, and in some cases more than to quality. Because in a viral world, in a social world, each piece of content that you publish is a kind of lottery ticket. And if you only buy a few lottery tickets a day, you only have that many chances of winning the viral lottery, of having that piece that generates 2 million views. But if you generate 50 pieces of content or 100 pieces of content a day, you're buying 100 viral lottery tickets. And a lot of sites that had insights into how how media could become viral began to take off and experience very quick traffic growth, even when a lot of legacy sites were finding it hard to grow at all. BuzzFeed, Upworthy. I mean, BuzzFeed is the site that was most predicated on understanding how viral media works. But there were risks that came with that too. Upworthy, are some of you familiar with that site? It was a kind of the site that became a kind of cliche for these narrative headlines they wrote. We'll tell you the true story of how this man and this child had an interaction that was amazing, and those were really optimized for Facebook because they were things that they piqued curiosity in a way that drove sharing. But then Facebook one day decided that it thought it was being taken advantage of and being gamed, changed its algorithm in a way that made Upworthy kind of fall off a cliff. Upworthy has come back some and does reasonable traffic. But there's always a danger with digital media that if you build your tree house in someone else's tree, that ultimately you don't have the independent relationship with the audience. You're so dependent on a single source, and that they may change the way that the algorithm that drives traffic to you sort of at any time for any reason, including that they sort of just don't like how well you're doing. But sort of bringing it up to the present, I think what we see right now is that the combination of mobile and social is where nearly all the audience growth is in digital media. In particular, it's smartphones plus Facebook. And that is what has now replaced the stationary browser-based experience. Still people interact with content that way, but I think you are unwise to expect that more people will interact with content that way in the future. Fewer people will interact with content that way in the future. And if you want to grow, you have to think about how people consume content, particularly on Facebook, but on various forms of social media, and not just on mobile, really on phones, because there's not significant growth in tablets either. And I think that's what puts publishers in the position they're in. It means there's some very positive sides to it, and there's some risks attached to it. One key advantage to it that I'm keenly aware of is you're connected to your audience 24/7, ubiquitously, wherever they are. I mean, in the early days, as I mentioned, content consumption was very heavily at work. We always spun that as a great advantage, for advertisers in the old days. There's no, how can you reach your market at work? You used to be able to reach them when they were watching TV at home or reading a newspaper. But really, it was a limitation because it meant that your traffic grew from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and that the rest of the time it was pretty weak. Now it's 24/7, and ubiquitous Wi-Fi means people are connecting to you everywhere all the time. But with the change, at first came lower CPMs, and it meant a loss of identity for a lot of destination sites, because if people are using Twitter or Facebook or any other platform as their primary tool for navigating digital media, the sites, the content creators kind of become subsidiary to that, right? And your identification, it's very different if you go to the New York Times or the Washington Post every day as a destination versus if you consume a lot of the New York Times or Washington Post via Facebook. There are people who consume those brands through social media and retain an identification with the brand, but there are also a lot of users for whom the content is really commoditized. And when you ask them what they're doing, they say, well, I'm reading the news on Facebook. They don't say I'm reading the news on the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the Globe and Mail, or whatever site it is. So that's a risk for publishers, that they have that loss of identity, that their identity is subsumed. And I think it also makes it very challenging in terms of paid content. The New York Times rolled out an app called NYT Now. I think it was maybe a little more than a year ago now, which I thought was excellent. I mean, it was a really good mobile news site, and they were trying to charge something like $8 US for it a month, which is a lot, significantly less than they charge for the access to the full site. And essentially, nobody would pay it. And they've gone back to having NYT Now be a free site that has less of the New York Times content, so they're not giving everything away. But just on mobile, the way people were consuming content, there was so much access to so much free stuff, and the habits and expectations around paying for content weren't even there to the extent that they've developed around paying for content on desktops and across digital products. I can talk a little, maybe at the end, if anybody wants to talk about video, I can talk about video. I was going to skip through it quickly. I mean, it was a big vogue for video content for publishers. There's tremendous advertiser demand for it. There's not so much user demand for it on editorial sites. So a lot of publishers are in a funny position right now where they're trying to create a lot of video content because they can sell ads against it, but it's very hard for them to get audience for the content. And the advertising experience around pre-roll advertising is generally a very poor one when you're asked to watch a 30-second, very often ad as the price for consuming some piece of short-form video content, which itself might only be 90 seconds. And I think particularly what happened around video content and advertising was the advertising, it became very clear, was a kind of tax on usage. Publishers couldn't really figure out didn't have paid models, couldn't figure out how to pay the costs of content creation. And with the sort of toll booth of watching a video ad, was a very clear illustration of sort of the model I sometimes call advertising as punishment, which I think works very poorly. And when you think about the economics of it, for video, the publisher might be getting a $30 CPM, which means if you do the math, that an advertiser has paid 3 cents for 30 seconds of user time. They're paying an effective rate of $3.60 an hour or less. It places a very low value on the time of the user. And I think users resent it. And I think both that poor video advertising experience and the sort of degraded experiences around display advertising which include all of the sort of trackers and beacons, as well as very interruptive, kind of eye-blasting type of ads, are what are now driving the rise of ad blockers, which has become very quickly becoming a kind of crisis for digital publishers. In Europe, their rates in some countries are around 50%, the number of people who are blocking the advertising on sites. There was a European court case that upheld ad blockers' right to sell out ad blockers. And that's now all precedent in the US, where ad blocker rates are rising very quickly. A site like Slate, the use of ad blockers is pretty low now. It's probably only 10%, maybe between 10 and 15%. But that too is only going in one direction. Some sites, particularly sites around gaming or technology, or sites that particularly have a young male audience, ad blocker use is very high. And that's all ad inventory, which is the main way that publishers like us pay the cost of creating content. That's just sort of going out the window very, very quickly. So there's tremendous concern around that. I think when you ask what else is happening in terms of how content is being consumed, paid for, what's the model going forward, I think distributed content is the big thing. That term sort of is just kind of coming into use, and it describes the way a number of the big platform companies are trying to integrate editorial content into their primary offerings. So the very first one was at Snapchat, the Discover page, where they started with a dozen publishers. I think they're now up to 15, and I don't think they're going to expand it further, creating a version of their content in a kind of rich media, semi-video, particularly for Snapchat, targeted at age under 25 users, very, very short form. Interesting because as opposed to the model of content being a sort of window that you go deeper and deeper into, the Snapchat Discover model is extremely finite. You're supposed to be able to, if you're the CNN version of Snapchat, is supposed to take, I think, maybe up to 90 seconds a day and no more. And then they say, goodbye, see you tomorrow. So you can't sort of keep consuming more of it if you like it. You get a kind of daily dose. But that was followed by Facebook Instant Articles, which is probably the biggest deal experiment in this regard as far as publishers are concerned. It's not fully rolled out in the United States, but it's an expanded beta test. There are a number of big publishers that are participating in it. Slate's participating in it. And what it does essentially is it eliminates what our tech people call the latency, and I just call the lag time, that it takes a page to load on your phone or on your desktop, but particularly on your phone. And we've all gotten used to it taking about 8 seconds, but in some cases up to 12 seconds, for a piece of content you want to fully render on phone. With Instant Articles, there's a version of it that's preloaded in the Facebook newsfeed, so it renders instantly. And I expect, and a lot of people expect, that as soon as that becomes the standard, no one is going to be willing to tolerate 8-second latency. It's just going to become second nature that when you ask for a piece of content on your phone, you're looking at it. We haven't seen numbers around that yet. It isn't fully rolled out, but every big tech company is now thinking about what's its version of this. So Apple rolled out Apple News just a few weeks ago, which is a native iPhone app that does something very similar with instantly rendered news from partners. Slate was a launch partner in that as well. It's always fun working with Apple because they're so secretive that when they would come for meetings, they made us put brown paper over the little transom slits in the conference room, so nobody could actually see into the conference room. Slate's taken the approach, and the others coming down the pike. Twitter this week launched something called Moments, which is its version of this. Google has a slightly different kind of project called AMD, which it's also announced isn't live yet. That's about radically decreasing the page load times on mobile pages. I imagine there'll be an Instagram version of this, but they haven't completely figured out how they relate to editorial content. You know, I think publishers have had a range of views about this. Some see the downside, which is you don't have the data you can collect from first-party data you can collect from users. You're again the sort of building your treehouse in someone else's tree. You're at the mercy of their whim. They're right now offering a very favorable deal to publishers where publishers can sell the advertising on Apple or Facebook and keep 100% of the revenue. But nobody's confident that that will last, and they may put the squeeze on at some point. That's all the downside. The upside is, if you believe, as I do, that this is where the growth is, this is where users are going, you have to figure out how to create content in the places where they're going to be and in the forms they are going to be most used to consuming content. So from my point of view, from Slate's point of view, it's almost not even a choice. We're going to have to figure out the business. I think the business could work quite well because I think our salespeople find it very appealing that they will be able to sell ads on Facebook and Apple on top of on Slate as a destination site. But to some extent, it's you're holding hands and jumping off the cliff because you become a bit of a hostage to the plans of the giant tech companies. I think from Slate's perspective, again, I think we do comparatively well in this world because Slate has a very distinctive voice. Those of you who know the publication, you can recognize a Slate article wherever it appears. You read it on Facebook. It's not commoditized news. It's not commoditized editorial content. And so I think it's going to be more durable translated onto these other platforms. But the risk is that if your content is more commoditized, you will have more and more people who will think they're reading Facebook and don't realize that they're reading content from a particular publisher. I think I should wrap it up there just to save a few minutes for questions. So one thing I did not talk about, and if anybody wants to ask a question, I will briefly, is about podcasting, which is, I think, probably the biggest sort of new growth story in media and something Slate has embraced for a long time and is now doing actually creating audio on-demand content for partners. And I think audio on demand is likely to supplant terrestrial radio, which is a very big market, in the same way that time shift viewing has supplanted live television. And so I think that's a trend to watch. And for those of you in international markets, it may be 6 months behind the US, it may be 12 months behind, it may be 18 months behind, but it's almost certainly on the same trajectory. And so I think that's another trend you're going to see as well.
Thank you, Jake.
Yeah.
An opportunity for questions. One question that occurs to me.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, we've got a round of applause. It's fascinating hearing a legacy digital publisher, because in effect, what you are. Has your business model changed over those 19 years? Or is that still what you started out? And would you start out with it now?
Yeah, very good question. When we started out, we had no business model. We had an editorial idea. And we wanted to have the biggest audience possible. So we were very resistant to charging for the content, although we did test that out in 1997.
Which didn't go well, I assume.
It didn't. Well, we signed up. Slate cost $20 in 1997, and we had some free content. But we signed up 20,000 paid subscribers, which was a lot then. But it wasn't nearly enough revenue to support the publication. And I think the conclusion we came to was, if we don't have a business model, we'd rather have one with the largest possible audience than with a small audience. So we reverted to being a free site, and we now have a membership tier, which is various kinds of added connections, special benefits, access to our live events, but the core content of Slate remains free. Our big imperative at the moment is to diversify our revenue stream. We have a business that's working, but it's very heavily dependent on advertising. Right. And the health of successful publishing businesses has always been built on multiple revenue streams. So we're trying very hard, even as we grow the advertising, to grow. There are other things we think that can grow faster, including user revenue from membership, events, podcasting. Those are all new sort of businesses coming out of our core business.
How much do you charge for membership?
It's $50 a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that is live events. Would you pay for really in-depth content, or is that part of the membership package?
We're starting to introduce that. So, for example, we do something we call Slate Academies, which are essentially podcast audio, almost university courses. And the first one we did was on the history of slavery in the Americas, and was a writer on staff who was very interested in it, interviewed all of the top experts. He told the story through the lives of 8 slaves who lived at different points in American history. Fantastic program, piece of content. That itself has driven thousands of memberships to Slate.
Right.
And so that's part of our model going forward, is to do more things like that.
Okay, but the revenue diversification, again, is a fascinating area, which would be lovely to dig into a bit more detail. But a question from the audience, and we've only got time for one, I think. Oh, yeah, is that? Would you like a box thrown at you, madam? Who? Oh, I suppose I can't, if he is behind, I can't see him at all then, can I? Oh, hello.
Oh, yeah.
I'm right here.
Yes.
So you talk about producing content for these distributed platforms, for Facebook, for Apple News. Can you give us a couple of examples of specific things Slate is doing or will do for those 2 platforms?
We're going to put all our content on those platforms. And again, we can do that because we're a free site. So as long as we can have the potential to get advertising revenue for us, that works for us. Some of the other publishers that have been early on those platforms have been testing them out with many fewer pieces of content. And the New York Times, for example, won't put all of its content on those platforms, and has been experimenting with very significant stories that in some cases it's refigured for those platforms. And I think it's the right idea in terms of you're going to have to see how users relate to content on those platforms, what lengths work, what sorts of audio and video formats work, what sorts of images, density of images. And it's quite possible that it's likely that it's going to be different. It's not going to be the same on Apple News and Facebook Instant Articles, and certainly not on Google Moments and Snapchat. And so one of the things looming out there that I think publishers are a little afraid of is, you're going to have to be producing individuated content for so many different platform streams.
Can I just ask on that, why? Because you've made the comment about smartphone, and there's a resurgence of long form on smartphone. What lies behind that, and the consumer thinking behind that?
Well, I think it's instinctive, and I think on phones, as I was saying, it was more the threshold of the screen becoming good enough and the downloads becoming fast enough that the phone was no longer an obstacle to consuming the content you want. So before, if you say something the length of a New Yorker article, if you're on your phone, it was going to take too long to get it, and once you got it, it was going to be an awkward experience. Now reading a New Yorker article on a phone is a fairly seamless experience. It's different from turning the pages of the magazine, but it's not necessarily worse. So if what you want to read at any given time is that article, you will now read it on a phone. 5 years ago, you would not have read it on a phone because the phone was not good enough.
Right. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A really exciting time.
Thanks very much.